They gave me something to stand on. Thank you so much for coming and welcome to the Coral Futures panel today. My name is Dee Dee Vaughn. I am the Director of Communications and Development for the Plant a Million Corals Foundation. We're going to have a panel of experts discuss the state of our coral reefs, current research, restoration, protection, and financing strategies, and why this is a message of hope. In today's climate of conservation and activism, coral reefs are seeing an increase in attention from the media and experts as the canary in the coal mine for climate change. This is because they are crucial to the symbiosis between humanity and the ocean. 1% of the oceans are covered by coral reefs, but they're habitat for 25% of the ocean's life. Coastal communities depend on coral reefs for protection, economy, and sustenance. Approximately 500 million people rely on reefs for food and livelihood. Coral reefs also provide protection for these communities by absorbing up to 97% of wave energy caused by storms and protect, in the U.S. alone, $1.8 billion of economic interest. As we've all have heard and many of us have experienced, our coral reefs are being lost rapidly, the unraveling of a great symbiosis inherent to our planet. But there's hope. Now I'd like to welcome Catherine Fleming on behalf of Coral Morphologic to present the Coral City Cameras, which captures the inspiring role the City of Miami plays in this story. Here, you can use mine. Sorry. That's all right.
So I'm Kate Fleming. I'm the founder and director of Bridge Initiative, a nonprofit that connects art and science to create public artwork about the environment. And one of my favorite projects I've ever gotten to work on is with Coral Morphologic, who is an artist-scientist duo, J.D. McKay and Colin Ford, who's a marine biologist. And their work talks about the symbiotic nature between corals and humans. So Coral City Camera is a live stream from the port of Miami. It's at the tip of the port, right between the shipping container boats and the cruise ships, actually. And it's a thriving coral reef, nonetheless. These boulders and riprap were put in about 10 years ago, and corals have propagated. Right now we're looking out kind of towards the deeper channel, and these staghorn corals were actually planted there a little under a year ago with Rescue Reef, a program with the University of Miami. And they've been really thriving and doing well. So Coral City Camera has now been streaming for about 2.5 years. It is a 360-degree camera that can rotate and has different views throughout the day. And it's in a kind of globe, and it has a windshield wiper. So we've been working also with NOAA to collect data 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the afternoon as well. There's a bunch of different residents of Coral City Camera also that have engaged the public. There's a surgeonfish. Oh, that's Colin cleaning the camera right now. Every 2 weeks we have to go and clean it with a toothbrush because the windshield wiper doesn't really do the trick. So it's actually quite shallow, so you can just snorkel and clean, and then he'll go and survey the staghorns. I sometimes go dive there as well, but it's usually Colin that does the cleaning. So anyway, hope you follow Coral City Camera on YouTube. It's really fun to stream while you're home. Sometimes there's a shark, sometimes there's Colin. Sometimes it's the damsel that actually has adopted Coral City Camera as its home and fights off anything going by it. And also follow it, Coral City Camera on Instagram, because it's a really great feed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce our panel. To begin with, we have Dr. David Vaughn, who's the founder of Plant a Million Corals. Maxime Phillip, who's the program analyst at the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. Rachel Serafin, senior biologist at the Florida Aquarium. and Morgan Bennett-Smith, founder of Red Sea Imaging. And if you could each go through and introduce yourself, starting with Dave, and give us a little bit of, let us know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, I've had a different past of working with seagrasses, as well as aquaculture of clams, oysters, shrimp, marine ornamentals for the aquarium trade, and finally corals for the aquarium trade. And I was told by the grandchildren of Jacques Cousteau, Philippe and Alexander, so why are you growing corals for the pet store, and why aren't you raising them for the reef? So I quickly had a change of a career and left my job at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute after 15 years and started working on growing corals for the reef. And I was lucky enough to make a mistake that helped make a new technology now called microfragmentation that gives us hope to grow corals at speed.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Maxime Philippe. I am a program analyst within the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. And what the Global Fund for Coral Reefs is a blended finance platform. So we have a grant fund and an equity fund. And the goal is to use grants, concessional loans, and then through that attract private sector investment into business models and reef positive solutions that can mitigate local drivers of degradation and give them the best chance to survive against climate change. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Seraphin, and I work at the Florida Aquarium. I actually went to college at Marist College up in Poughkeepsie, and then after college started working at the Florida Aquarium, just a biologist there. Found a real passion for breeding seahorses and other cygnathrids, and then kind of got interested in keeping corals in closed aquaria. When the opportunity came for us to be opening our off-site campus and to be using some of those skills to hold Caribbean corals in closed systems for restoration purposes, I jumped on that, and now we've successfully spawned and bred about 14 species of corals and that are from Florida, and working with other reef practitioners, providing larvae and corals for those restoration practices.
Hi everyone, my name is Morgan Bennett-Smith. I'm a marine ecologist and underwater media specialist. Most of my work focuses in Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea on the Arabian side, and I'm involved in a lot of different projects, but mostly kind of straddling the realms of science and media. So this is what I do.
Well, thank you so much. And this is really to everyone. As an expert in your discipline, what would you like to see changed in coral sectors? We often hear how humanity needs to course correct and rapidly to save our reefs. But what steps need to be taken at the institutional, governmental, and large-scale funding levels? We can start with Dave.
Well, I think the biggest thing that was said in one of the previous days is that you can do things such as sensors if you do them by large amounts. And it's the same with corals. If we don't do this at scale, we'll just be talking about it. We can talk about it being able to do a few like a gardener, but this has to be a large scale. This has to be a large scale, and it has to be done now. It's not one, it's got to have to be action. In order to do so, we have the technologies now to literally, like our name of our foundation, plant 1 million corals. I hope to plant 1 million corals within the next 2 years. And if we can show people around the world how also to do that, we can make a big difference. We still need to stop the pressures, but if we wait till the pressures are done, so will the reefs be done. So we have to keep them alive, not just for the corals, but for all the other organisms that rely on the reef, or else we'll have to bring them back somehow later.
Great, and maybe from my perspective, so traditionally conservation is very grant-based. It's short-term grants, they're small scale, and the idea is to make it financially sustainable. And the only way to do that is to communicate the value of coral reefs that if we protect them, it'll last longer. The value that they bring annually in ecotourism, in fishing income, in so many different ways, and coastal protection will be preserved. And the way we do that is by putting forth the ways you can generate revenue streams around coral reef ecosystems. So really just doing that transformational change towards making conservation and business find common ground.
To their points also, I think, as everybody in this room knows, it's a little bit harder for everybody to grasp the issues that are happening underwater, to really understand what we're seeing and what needs to be done. So in my opinion, limiting, slowing climate change, cleaning up our oceans, especially in Florida, looking at nutrients or land-based pollution, and also just like Dave was saying, sharing that knowledge that we've gained to other regions of the world who are just starting to see the decline, and kind of using the lessons that we've learned, or Dave has really learned, to be able to transfer that knowledge and help them boost up and act faster than we could.
Yeah, and I think inspiration, as Dave said, is such a critical part of it. And 2 million corals is like, that's so exciting for a lot of people, and showing that and telling the world about that, that's what we try to do. It's all related and incredibly important.
So how would we finance? How are we going to finance all of this? We mentioned that funding is so important, and coral restoration efforts and enforcement of marine protected areas are not a cheap task, and they're required at scale for larger than they're at present. I'd like to start with Maxime with this one. What do you see going forward are some successful ways to fund these programs? And then for the rest of the panel, how have you had either issues or successes with funding?
Sure. So our approach is really abundant finance approach, and it's also what we call an integrated ecosystem approach. So you try and address all the local drivers of degradation in one coral reef area. So if you have too many nutrients coming from poor agricultural practices, you can put money forth towards new fertilizer, best practices in agriculture to create an organic product that sells at a higher price, but also has a better impact on the environment. And then you also have developing tourism towards more friendly practices. And through these are more like smaller scale livelihood opportunities, but then you can also incubate larger infrastructure projects to do with waste management or other food production, large-scale fisheries. But the way you do that is really through abundant finance, because the private sector is uncomfortable going straight to these unfamiliar contexts, whether it be Indonesia or the Philippines or these small island developing states. So you have to de-risk these initial investments, have a proof of concept, and then attract private sector capital. So yeah, it's really about abundant finance, demonstrating that it is possible and making sure you can tell the story, which I think the colleagues here are really good at, probably.
One way to fund it is to make it affordable. Our first corals 10, 15 years ago cost us $1,000 a coral because we were producing 600. Now, costs are under $100 a coral. That's still too high. My cost in the last few years was $10 a coral. I hope to, within the next 2 years, get it $2 a coral. For the price of a cup of coffee, somebody could be helping to afford planting a coral, if it's done at scale and then economically. The other is our systems, like Florida Aquarium, are land-based systems. They're tanks on land that people can look at, like a public aquarium and an attraction. Who wouldn't want to see corals up close that are being grown and grown fast of the species, and be able to pay for an eco-educational attraction? I think that's one way to fund coral restoration.
Yeah, and so my perspective from Saudi Arabia is a little different from Florida, because in Saudi Arabia the connection of the people to the ocean is a lot less, and historically this very deep historical connection that you see in a lot of small island developing states, it's not really present in a lot of places in the Middle East. So we're starting from a very different place, trying to encourage first a connection with the ocean through visual media, so that we can follow that up with these kinds of opportunities and then generate money moving in and out in this way. So these kinds of visual projects, like showing people in real life corals growing, I think are incredibly useful.
Very similarly, we are funded by, we have the backing of a nonprofit organization, but we're heavily funded by grants, by local and state and federal governments, and there's a lot of buy-in into programs like ours, but it's expensive. I don't know our exact cost, but it's not $2. It might be closer to $500. But keeping them in closed systems and the technology associated with that and the knowledge that's needed to care for them is something that is costly. And so whether it's private donations, grants, or the aquarium being able to use some of their funds, their profits towards this, it's a lot of work to kind of making sure that we have all of that in place and try to design a program to utilize it efficiently.
And for restoration in particular, there's kind of other revenue or financial mechanisms coming into play, like reef insurance, where the hotel, the tourism sector, the infrastructure impacted that benefits from the coastal protection of coral reefs pays a premium every month or every year. And when a disaster does happen, like a large hurricane or a bleaching event, it can fund these task brigades or reef brigades that go out and restore them. So it's getting that private sector would really appreciate the value that reefs bring them, not only for tourism, but for coastal protection and making a kind of a holistic kind of financing mechanism for it.
It is tough having a product that's not really has a sale in the marketplace. When I worked with clams and oysters and shrimp, there was always a business plan and an investor ready. But when you're growing something to put back for the betterment of mankind in the open ocean, it becomes a lot more difficult. We've had some good success with Schmidt Family Foundation funding and some other family foundations. But in the long term, this is going to have to be big, and it's going to have to be done in every tropical island where there's corals. And I think if that happens, we really need to learn the things that it serves. Coastline protection, food, oxygen. Part of the oxygen coming from the oceans that we use in every other breath comes from the ocean, and some of that comes from the algae that's inside corals. So all of those things need to have a value somehow and portrayed to help restore it for all of those other species as well as mankind, and for us in the future.
Thank you. One of the things that is really on the tips of everybody's tongues these days are marine protected areas, and it's really beginning to take off, even if there still is a lot of work to be done. Some argue that that won't mean anything if we don't curb our carbon emissions, but how true is this, and is there an interplay between limiting coastal pollution and industrial overfishing and the resilience of reefs to climate change?
I'll go because I'm in line, I guess. Obviously, both things have to happen. We learned long ago on land to make national parks and preserves. We're just learning to do that now in the ocean. We should have started years ago. And but we can't wait until that's done and it be the only solution. If we wait till every one of the stressors is solved on this planet, it'll be too late for corals. It's got to be a dual, two-pronged approach. Save the corals, save their function by making living coral reefs, and we have the technology to do that today while we are lowering those stressors so that when hopefully all the stressors are gone and at least lowered so the rest of the animals can have a fighting chance, then we'll have a living reef and we can even make it bigger.
I think we often don't realize how connected these things are, and it's easy to say, why would we focus on small-scale solutions or restoring one particular reef when that's just a drop in the bucket? But I think, like the national park example, using these stories to tell a bigger story about why we should save everything is really important as well.
Yeah, and maybe just in terms of, so you have climate change that's going to devastate a lot of reefs. There's no way around it. So the approach we're taking is really to focus on those reefs that exhibit kind of some resilience to climate change. There might be heat-tolerant species, or they're in a corridor where there's colder water coming up. But to really focus MPAs and the resources on those MPAs is kind of critical to having as part of your strategy, because there's no way we're going to save all of them. So we have to focus on those ones that have high biodiversity value, ability to withstand climate change, and concentrate there. And if you address overfishing, they'll have a better chance of rebounding from climate change impacts, because they'll be able to graze the algae and so on.
So with all of these issues, what do each of you see as the biggest threat to restoration, preservation, and conservation? That being things like disease, funding, or scalability. And we'll start from the other end with Morgan.
Well, this is a little bit out of my niche, but at least in Saudi Arabia, funding is not a problem. Scalability, the technology really seems to be there. I mean, Dave has done remarkable work. So I guess what we're worried about is that we do all this restoration, we put the corals in place, and then the ecological conditions don't let them grow, right? And this is where we hope that the underlying science that's selecting for more resilient corals will pay off. But it's a little bit hard to predict, at least where we are, because we haven't gotten that far yet.
I think in some regions, scalability can definitely be a factor, and probably funds are setting up reef restoration nurseries or land-based nurseries, but I think there's still a lot of work to do, and time is moving forward and climate continues to change, and increased storm activity, bleaching events that are prolonged and result in death, or increased disease or new diseases that are decimating reefs. Those are all factors that are working against us. So we need to be able to change, to act quickly, and to be able to change with our changing ocean and find those corals that can adapt. There's definitely going to be regions where the coral reefs are going to have to shift. We're not going to be able to kind of protect certain areas, but facilitating that in any way we can is going to be a key component of that.
Yes, so from my perspective, again, it's the financing perspective of how we fund all this, but it's really getting private sector investment at scale, and for that we need de-risking from grants and from philanthropic investors who are able to have that more patient capital to really invest in these places and take that initial risk to demonstrate that it is possible, and then from there on we can scale with these larger private sector investments.
It's a big ocean, and so I think we need to show that it can be done on a scale that's so huge, but by one step at a time. If we take an area the size of this room, and with just a few thousand corals in little as 2 to 5 years, you can turn it into many looking like it looked 40 years ago. And there are examples of that. So if we show examples, and if you can see what can be done, people don't question reforestation anymore because you can see it happening. But corals are a little bit out of sight, a little bit hidden, and so it's a harder one for people to look down. If we had actually had what takes place under the ocean take place on the land, coral bleaching. If you woke up this morning and looked outside and every tree had turned white and every flower and the grass had turned white, you'd say, stop, let's change this. But that's what's happening underwater, but you're just not seeing it. So we need everybody realize, instead of like, don't look up, look down and see what our ocean's secrets and our beautiful world is happening to it, and we can change it if we have the will.
So coral bleaching is getting a lot of news and has in the past few years. Rachel, I'd like to really send this to you. How bad is it, and what is being done to deal with it? And is this where genetic adaptation and restoration of specific genotypes come in?
Absolutely. So coral bleaching is a normal occurrence. It is a protective action by those corals. And what we're seeing is increased events or maybe bleaching starting earlier in the season where the temperatures haven't even peaked, and resulting in coral death or just loss of these areas. But we're also seeing disease, and again, disease is completely normal. There's, I don't know, 40 different coral diseases just in the Caribbean, and I can't even imagine in other regions of the world, and they're normal occurrences. But with new diseases like stony coral tissue loss disease that started kind of in Miami and has now moved through the Florida Keys, has hit the dry Tortugas last year, and has shown up in nearly every other part of the Caribbean, those losses are astronomical. Talking about massive colonies of pillar corals that are the size of a car lost in 3 weeks. So where disease might affect one portion of a colony in the past, now we're seeing it decimate reefs, anywhere from 60 to 100% mortality depending on the species. And how do we fight that? And how do we stop it? So there's a lot of push for that research, and figuring out those issues underwater are a little bit more complicated when you don't necessarily fully understand the microbiome or the analytic community of corals. And I think now we can say it's closely related to the zooxanthellae that's in their tissue. Excuse me. So a virus that starts there that's actually causing the coral to lose the tissue. And researchers have been working around the clock. This disease started in 2014. And we're just starting to get along with what's happening and how to work with it. But for my organization, and we've been collecting corals from reefs with the help of the federal government and Association of Zoos and Aquariums, where they've actually taken healthy corals from the Florida Reef Track and brought them into closed aquaria, 25 or so different facilities around the U.S. And it's funny, people joke, why are there corals from Florida going to Omaha? Because there's a coral expert there, and the expertise of keeping these corals in closed aquarium is so minute in the world of corals. People are very well practiced with the hobbyist world of keeping Pacific corals. But just learning more about these corals, being able to watch them, see what they need, be able to sample them or figure out their genotypes and create kind of this genetic group of corals that we can hold on to as we continue to watch the disease move through, unknowing or not knowing how to stop it. So really what we're facing are, increased bleaching events, increased storm events where corals have no time to recover, and then excess nutrients or other things feeding into coral disease now proliferating around the reef track, in Florida especially. But when does it start happening in other regions? We're seeing a massive die-off of a key herbivore, Diadema antillarum, right now around the Caribbean, which is terrifying. We saw a die-off of them in the 80s, and here it's happening again. We don't even know what happened in the 80s, what caused it, and it's starting to spring up, and it's connected to shipping ports, multiple islands. So it's depressing for the fact that we don't necessarily have the technology or have the knowledge to figure out what's going on in time to stop what's happening or make change, political change, changing out ballast water or using UV or bleaching, chlorine to disinfect ballast water. We don't have those in place, and we can't put it in place fast enough. So that side of it is pretty depressing. But yes, bringing in genetic individuals to closed systems like we do has given us the opportunity to not only hold these corals and learn about them and use that research for maybe doing applications of different medications for these corals to treat, but also, out of the 17 corals that we hold, we can now watch them spawn and create new generations. So just that knowledge that we're gaining is key. With grouped brain coral, we didn't necessarily have scientists in the field in Florida 5 years ago who were reliably seeing them spawn. And being able to work with them and be like, hey, they spawned yesterday, or earlier today, we have it shifted, so 4 hours ahead. You guys should go out in the water tonight. And then to have those researchers go out to reefs and find those corals spawning and be able to collect those gametes from those corals, because those corals are surviving corals that have seen disease and have survived it. So using those individuals for their genetics, there is a lot more hope now. this collaboration between many practitioners and using that knowledge that we've gained to teach other regions and also inspire other people in other areas.
Yeah, everybody's heard about bleaching, but everybody doesn't know that some corals bleach and then survive. Some corals are not bleaching. We've lost half the world's corals that basically did not survive the diseases or the bleaching. And most of the time, bleaching usually succumbs to disease afterwards. And so we're taking the corals that didn't bleach or that recovered after bleaching, and we're making more of those. And just as if a fire went through a forest, but it didn't affect all of them, trees, you'd want to, Mother Nature would have those survive. We just can't wait 100 years for Mother Nature to grow those corals back slowly. We need to restore it, replant it, and we can do that. And so bleaching is one of those things where it's a triple problem. People worry about or don't worry about a couple of degrees average temperature. But it's that couple of degrees that can make corals bleach not once every 100 years, but now almost every single year. And so we've got to work on both sides of removing those stresses as well as taking the ones that survive bleaching and making more of those, because they're the corals of tomorrow.
So what was your aha moment when you realized that something you were doing or planning was really going to make a difference in coral reef conservation? And I am going to start with Dave on this one.
Well, most people, I don't have to think twice about it because I made the front page of the New York Times science section above the fold. It was called my Eureka mistake. By accident, I broke one of our first test tube baby corals from sexual reproduction. It was 3 years old, but growing very slow. I went to move it into another tank, and by accident broke it into hundreds of pieces, or dozens of pieces. And I thought I hurt it and it wouldn't recover. Instead, it grew 25 times faster. And so we now have a new technology. It's a game changer for corals. It's called microfragmentation. It's sort of like tissue culture for plants. Instead of taking a golf ball sized corals and waiting 2 years till it gets a little bigger and make 2, we make 100, and it grows up to that size in months instead of years. We have identical clones. We plant those clones near each other like the size of a pizza with 20 pepperonis on it, and they grow in just 2 years, touch each other, recognize themselves as their own genetics, and instead of fighting, they fuse back together. So we're fusing 75-year-old size coral heads in just 2 years, and they become reproductive because they start acting like a mature adult, even though they're the age of a kindergartner.
So for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs is quite new, so our mid-term aha was really getting those partnerships together. So within the fund we have private philanthropy, we have a private equity fund partner managing the equity fund, and then we have also member state donors, so country governments within the UN grant side of the fund. But within at the program level, we're also pushing conservation-oriented NGOs to work with new partners that they haven't generally worked with, so that can be financial banks, that can be incubators and venture capital funds. So we're working towards that, but that really eureka moment is going to come when we prove our concept. We've only been operational for 1 year, but once we can start attracting private sector investment into these different reef positive solutions, I think that'll make a wave, as we say.
I kind of have two. So the first one, we have corals that are shifted a few hours. It makes our day a little bit easier to be watching coral spawn at 2 p.m. rather than 11 p.m. And we worked with Jamie Craig at the Horniman Museum setting up our systems and the programming and to mimic everything that a natural reef would have. So the water chemistry, the lighting, the cues, that gametogenesis that happens within the coral skeleton tissue starts months before. So it's a full year process that you're trying to prepare for. So the first year that we had corals spawn exactly when they should have was really incredible, and spawned according to the lights and to the moon. Just still debated whether it's the moonlight or the gravitational pull, but really just incredible to have them go off at the exact minute that we wanted them to. And having 8 out of 9 spawn within a 7 to 10 minute period was really incredible. And then a couple weeks ago, we were checking on some of our outplants that we outplanted in 2019, a few hundred staghorn corals, all genetic individuals that we outplanted when they were about 1.5 years. And we went out there a couple weeks ago. Because of COVID, we hadn't been able to revisit the site as often as we wanted. And there were some wild colonies at this site called Stag Party. I don't know if you know it, Dave. Do you know Stag Party? Probably. Tennessee Reef. But anyway, so we went out to Stag Party, and we had planted some of our corals out near wild colonies of staghorn corals. And when they first went out, they were skinny and awkward. And then, after a few months of monitoring, they bulked up and they started to look like everybody else around them. And then going out a couple weeks ago, our babies were massive in comparison to any wild colony that's probably been there for years, decades. So to see our thickets that we had created towering over the natural colonies gave us a lot of hope that this new generation of corals will be prepared to actually go out there and hopefully, something will stick. Everybody likes to use the term super coral, and that'll take a lot in R&D. But if we can create 10,000 corals a year, 5,000 corals a year, new genetic individuals, and put them out there and learn to cultivate the ones that really make it, we have a lot more hope than I thought we did 5 years ago.
That's awesome. So I really hope that most of my big aha moments are ahead of me, not behind me. But one from the last year has been a Nat Geo project we worked on that's focused on the research in the Saudi Arabian Red Sea. And for me, the most gratifying part of working on these kinds of projects is seeing the reactions of people who don't understand or realize that they're living on top of these systems. And this is such a unique perspective because most people who live in beautiful coral reefs understand that they live over a beautiful coral reef. And so to share scenes from these incredible underwater habitats with people who live there but have no idea and inspire them to go get dive certified, and dive tourism in the area is like brand new and really not an industry that's been prolific so far. This is really rewarding for what I do.
Well, I love that everyone seems to have a thread of hope that connects them. So that leads to optimism is so important in the ocean world today. How do we make sure that we're focusing on the positive message of hope? You can start.
Well, I think the biggest thing is to talk to the youth. I always tell them in a program that we have with the Boy Scouts, we're using STEM education with a coral nursery. And I told them that in my generation, we turned over losing half the world's corals. And in their generation, we can bring it back. And they get that hope. And as long as there's some hope, otherwise it's just gloom and doom and there's nothing to do. So part of the hope is, as someone once told me, hope should really be help on planet Earth. And that's what we need. We need that hope, and we need to get going, and we need to get going with the techniques that work now.
Yes. So I think hope is really, you have to demonstrate these success stories, and I think the colleagues here are all in that boat, working towards that. You have these reefs in different areas that can survive, and if we support them and we give them the best chance and we demonstrate how we did it, that can inspire a lot of people that these creatures can come back.
Definitely having hope, but also being realistic. We've definitely seen hyperbole in the media where they'll say this discovery is going to save all of the reefs. And that can be dangerous because people can say, oh, great, they're saved. Everything's fine now. Or there was the article in 2019 that said the Great Barrier Reef is now officially dead, which is a little drastic. But it does bring to the point that this is a major issue that we need to take note of. So finding that happy place in the middle where you're not discouraging people from, you could really affect the tourism of an area by saying that it's all dead, don't worry about it, don't come here, versus being like everything's fine, everything's great. We still need people to be understanding that there's still a lot more that needs to be done and that we need to kind of focus on that restoration and continuing forward.
Yeah, and I think accurately representing science, like you say, is so critical. And I think the academic system we have really doesn't train up-and-coming scientists to be able to communicate this. Like, we really don't focus on science communication. And then when you get to this point, you really lose this ability, and you're either drastically being hyperbolic, or you need to be trained, I think, from an early start in your career, how to effectively and accurately communicate your science, but hopefully also keep it positive. And this is a really tricky thing to do, but more important than ever, I think.
So what is something easy that we all can do to make a difference for reefs, even just as an individual in a broader system that can sometimes feel out of our control?
Well, I always like to tell the story of myself. I happened to at one time own a pickup truck that got 8 miles per gallon. I finally traded it in and got one that got 12 miles per gallon. I finally sold it and bought a Prius. I finally sold it and got an electric car. I've changed my boat into an electric boat. I always tell people I used to commute to work across the canal that I hold my breath. I don't even expel any carbon dioxide while I'm canoeing. And that's a little funny, but it explains what ocean acidification is. It's too much carbon dioxide. It's literally you're holding the breath of the ocean. So you can do a better job in your transportation of your own car.
And I would say just kind of voicing your concern and how much you value these different natural ecosystems. We make a lot of fun of social media. There's a lot of bad things on social media, but at the same time, these social and environmental issues have come at the forefront of the government and private sector because everybody is complaining about how the business as usual case. So it's really just voicing your concern and having it get to the higher levels so that they change the way they're acting.
Limiting your carbon footprint, even if you're in a position in which you can make choices for maybe an organization to focus that way, inspire others to change, continue to learn and communicate with others about these issues, and vote, pressure policymakers to make the right policies that will enact change.
I think we've covered a lot there, but just I think generally thinking about how what you do impacts the ocean and just kind of keeping the ocean in the back of your mind as you do different everyday activities. Most of these activities may not be impactful, but some of them will be. And so if you're just kind of thinking in that mindset, you'll inevitably adjust some behaviors. You'll recycle more, you'll drive less. And these things, I think, little by little will help make a change.
So our final question, to take a humorous page from the podcast, How to Save the Planet, how screwed are we? And what gives each of you hope?
Well, I'm going to go back to the burning of fossil fuels. If we could turn back time 100 years and realize what we were doing now, or we did to ourselves, it'd be a different story. I tell people, let's stop burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow, or we'll get our wish.
So what gives me hope is, I think I've said it already, but there are bright spots, there are hope spots, there are resilient areas, but also as a society we're moving towards better practices. It's just a little slow and later than we wanted, but we're getting there. So if we can accelerate as much as possible with the help of everyone through voicing your concern, through changing your practices on a daily basis, I think we can get there and save it and let it come back.
Absolutely. I think what gives me hope is our ability to evolve and the technology we can put into place. As for how screwed we are, we're not out of the woods yet, but I would say in the last 20 years, I feel like maybe 20 years ago, everybody said global warming's a hoax, it's not real. To have that mindset not only shift, but then now everybody's actively thinking about it, and it becomes a normal, everyday topic of, yes, it's real, yes, it's happening, yes, we need to use less straws, we need to change our habits, use less plastic. It gives me hope that we can continue to move away from kind of that previous thought.
Yeah, it gives me hope to listen to the people on this panel. I mean, that's really inspiring. And also every time I dive in the Red Sea, where we've got temperatures that are hotter than most places in the planet, and we see really pristine reefs, this also gives me hope. So we know that it's possible for corals to adapt, and hopefully with some help, we'll get there. So.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I believe Rachel has some footage to share after the panel, and then Morgan, if you can introduce your video.
Yeah. Should we sit down? Yeah, we'll let you go. So we just have one little video which we shot in the Red Sea, mostly aimed at this theme of hope and trying to keep a positive outlook on coral reefs, and especially in the Arabian Red Sea, where we're still learning a lot about these habitats. And so this video was shot originally in Arabic and then changed to English just to show the beauty of the systems that we work in.
I just put together a few video clips that should be shown in the library after this, if anybody's interested, and it's just of coral spawning, coral larvae swimming around, feeding corals. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Back up. I just want to say thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This has been wonderful to be able to share the messages that we have, the great experts that we have here, and to really let people know that while we all hear that coral reefs are in trouble, that it's something that we can take an active role in fixing and getting better, and there's definitely hope for the future. Thank you.
So
so I definitely don't need this. Dee, thank you so much, and thank you to your expert panel of coral scientists and experts and artists. We're just so thrilled by what you've done and raising our hope level for the future, so thank you. We would like to move along and introduce you to the next panel, which is our penguin panel. And penguins, I believe, are everyone's favorite flightless bird. And the penguin this year for World Oceans Week is one of our ambassadors. For those of you who were here last evening, you were treated to the octopus and octonation. Tonight we have everything penguin. We have a penguin parlor downstairs, which will help you think of and dream about your next trip to Antarctica. And while you're dreaming about your next trip to Antarctica, you can maybe think about our virtual auction, which has a fabulous trip on it, sponsored by Lindblad. And on your way to the Penguin Parlor, you can stop and have a penguin specialty cocktail at the Lindblad Bar. And after the panel, we'll have some special treats for you in the Penguin Parlor. We'll have some punch and some sledging biscuits that you'll hear a little bit more about from Heather. And we'll have a book signing. So our world-class panelists of penguin experts will be there to sign books and to answer your questions. For those of you who were lucky enough to be here last night, you met Ellen Pickich, our marine scientist from Stony Brook University. And Ellen was the driving force to have Shinnecock Bay named one of the hope spots from Sylvia Earle's Blue Mission. And so we're just so proud of all the work that Ellen has done. So, Ellen, I'd like you to introduce your panelists for us this evening. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Constance, for that lovely introduction, and it's great to be back at the podium a second day in a row. World Oceans Week has been fabulous so far, and I'm sure it's going to continue to be even better and better as the week goes by. I've been looking forward to today's Penguin Hour for quite a while now. I may not be a penguin expert myself, but some of my best friends are penguin experts, and you're going to meet some of them soon. Also, I like to say that penguins are actually fish in penguin clothing, and I study fish, so you'll see why as you listen to the panelists tonight. Okay, let's be honest. Penguins aren't just our favorite flightless birds, but how many of you don't love penguins? Maybe they're your favorite bird. I think they're mine. So we're very fortunate today to have three of the world's preeminent experts in penguin science and conservation join us. I'm going to have them do most of the talking because they're the experts, and we really want to learn from them and their experiences. Our first panel member is Pablo Borborglou. I refer to him as Popey, as many of his friends do. He hails from Argentina, from Patagonia, and he founded and directs the Global Penguin Society, which is our partner organization for the Ambassador Penguin Program. So, Popey, please.
Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you so much, Ellen, for the introduction. And well pronounced. Surname is difficult. That's why I'm called Poppy. And thank you so much to all of you for your interest in our session. Today I'm going to show you why penguins can inspire global conservation. And in this presentation, I'm also going to share some of the main conservation issues that penguins were facing in the recent years, some of our recent challenges, and also accomplishments. So how many penguins do you think there are on our planet? 5, let's make an auction. 10, 12. There are 18 different species of penguins that breed across islands and continents throughout the southern hemisphere. But unfortunately, half of them are considered threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So let me show you the world from the penguin perspective. This is the way penguins perceive our planet, with Antarctica in its center. They have colonies there, also in New Zealand and southern Australia, in South Africa and Namibia, and they breed in 4 countries in South America. And the yellow arrow indicates the place where I am based, in southern Argentina, in Patagonia. So among the 18 different species of penguins, there is a wide variety of sizes and body weights, ranging from the little blue penguin that lives in southern Australia and New Zealand with only 3 pounds and 1 foot tall, up to the giant emperor penguin in Antarctica that is almost 90 pounds and 3 feet tall. But contrary to the belief that all penguins live on ice and they live on Antarctica, there are only 4 species of penguins that are more linked to those kinds of environments, including these ugly penguins that you can see in the image. But most of the species, they are temperate species of penguins. They live outside of Antarctica, like this humble penguin chick that is hugging a cactus in the desertic area of coastal Peru. And we even have tropical penguins, like the Galapagos penguin in Ecuador. They live in lava caves. And did you know that there are penguins in the forest living? How many of you, pick up your hands, knew that there were penguins living in the forest? Oh, Dee and my colleagues. Can you find the penguin in the picture? Yes? Yes, well done. It's here. You don't have to look up because you know they don't fly, right? So these Fjordland penguins, they live in deep caves under logs and trees in very steep slopes in deep fjords of New Zealand. It's very difficult to work with them because it's hard even to find them. And penguins are excellent indicators of the health of the oceans because they're very sensitive to all the alterations in the oceans. In addition, penguins have specific characteristics that make them more vulnerable to all the threats that the oceans are facing. For example, they live in colonies, so in one moment of the year, they are all concentrated in one spot and they are more vulnerable to some threats like oil spills, for instance. They lay only 1 or 2 eggs per season, so if they lose those eggs, they will lose the entire breeding season. And they swim hundreds and thousands of kilometers exploring vast areas of our oceans where they come into conflict with human activities. And penguins have a dual life in the ocean, but also on land when they come to breed. So they accumulate threats in both environments. And the main threats are caused by climate change, marine pollution, fisheries, and human disturbance. Climate change, one of the main effects, it is that it is changing the availability of food close to the colonies when chicks are small, which is the moment when food is mostly needed. And climate change has also been increasing the frequency and the duration of heat waves. So penguins pant like dogs to dissipate the excess of heat, and they also eliminate the excess of heat through the flippers and the legs, because all their bodies are covered by feathers, so they cannot eliminate the heat. But sometimes we have very strong heat waves, and in those days we can have mortalities or even healthy penguins in one afternoon. Dee reported a case in which in one afternoon there was over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and 260 penguins died in one afternoon. But the other sad thing is that that climate change is triggering wildfires. And penguins have never been exposed to fire during their evolution, so they don't recognize the fire as a threat. They don't escape, they don't run away, and they have been seen preening their feathers very calmly behind the flames until they die. Fisheries can also be a threat because they compete for food with the penguins, or penguins can get entangled in the fishing nets during the fishing operations. And oil spills have killed thousands of penguins in many continents. Fortunately, the impact of oil spills have decreased in the last years, but we are now having a problem with plastic pollution. And on top of these more global threats, we have issues that are lower scales related with habitat destruction. We think that everybody loves and respects penguins, but that is not always the case. Last November, we reported a case in which a landowner with a bulldozer destroyed 22,000 square feet of a penguin colony. In one of the areas, he built a road of almost 1 mile, removing all the native vegetation where penguins were nesting and removing all the soil where the caves were in. And here you can see the image from a drone, so you can see the burrows, the different nests, and penguins also nest under the bushes. So you can see the impact of the road here. The colony was completely wiped out in these areas. Thanks to National Geographic that provided the satellite images, we discovered that 60% of this harm was done in a date when penguins were incubating eggs or with chicks smaller than 2 weeks old. So there's a legal case now. We are working very hard to gather evidence so he doesn't get away with murder, and we hope that the benefits for the penguins can compensate the harm. So again, to help penguins deal with all these issues, we created the Global Penguin Society. In a nutshell, we generate knowledge and we transform the knowledge into efficient conservation action. In terms of science, we conduct our own projects and we support projects that generate useful information for conservation. We are strengthening right now, for example, we work in different countries. In New Zealand, we are strengthening our program. And in the next video, you can listen to Ursula, which is one of our representatives in New Zealand, and she's sharing some of the results.
So we use satellite trackers to follow their pre-molt dispersal. And we found that birds traveled up to 2,500 kilometers away, covering distances of close to 7,000 kilometers. That's halfway to Antarctica. No other crested penguin species known to travel that far during this time of their annual cycle.
So this was a big surprise because this was one of the least studied penguins of all. We thought they were really feeding close to New Zealand, but they travel halfway to Antarctica. And this information is critical for us to create protected areas in places where they overlap with human activities. We are also partnering with colleagues in South Africa to help identify the feeding routes of the penguins, because that information will help stop the plans of the fisheries to eliminate the current protected areas. This is critical because this African penguin is in danger now. The population collapsed from 2.2 million adults 100 years ago to 20,000 adults now. And a big part of our project is to create protected areas. So far, we have been able to help protect 32 million acres of penguin habitat in the ocean and also on land. And we also design the management plans in participatory processes, including the communities, the government, and also the decision makers. Protected areas are amazing because we do not only protect penguins, we benefit all the species that coexist with penguins, and that generates education opportunities for the local communities. And through ecotourism, we generate incomes and jobs for all the regional economy in developing countries. But there is no possible conservation if we don't engage and educate the communities. So through a massive education program, we reach local and global audiences. So take a look at this video to learn about our actions.
Penguins reflect how wonderful and fragile our planet Earth is. They are indicators of the health of the oceans and reveal to us the problems caused by human actions. Global Penguin Society is an international organization that promotes the conservation of all 18 penguin species in the world and the protection of the coasts and oceans they inhabit. To help penguins cope with the main threats they face, we work to generate useful conservation science, promote the protection of their habitats, and carry out multiple environmental education activities. Our education program aims to foster a conservation culture so that people value and understand the importance of protecting penguins and their environments. Through one of our main educational activities, we bring local students and communities to visit penguin colonies in person. Kids are visiting penguin colonies often for the first time in their lives, despite living very close in the same region. We offer them the experience of meeting penguins so that the next generation appreciate and preserve them. We provide lessons, donate books, and provide educational materials to schools so that learning continues in the classroom and at home. In addition to teaching local communities, we also carry out virtual education programs to reach the international community of children and adults. This includes digital educational material on our website, online classes to thousands of students streamed live from remote penguin colonies, as well as presentations and lectures given in person in multiple countries. Penguins live both at the sea and on land, so they uniquely face threats in both environments. Plastic pollution is one of the major threats that affects penguins on different continents, putting their lives at risk. To raise awareness of this growing problem in the communities, we organize beach cleanup events at penguin colonies and nearby areas. We also carry out awareness campaigns to reduce the consumption of single-use plastics at beach resorts. All these actions aim at generating behavioral changes to benefit the environment. The health of the oceans is critical for the survival of penguins and the state of our planet. Learn more about these charismatic animals.
But 100 years since we even really got our foot in the door in Antarctica is amazing enough. But actually, it's only been about 25 years since we had the first real pictures of Antarctica from satellites, which is pretty amazing. The entire history of the satellite era has occurred within our lifetimes, at least those of us, you know, a little bit older in the crowd. So we've just started being able to use satellites to study Antarctic, and as you'll see over the last decade, it's really revolutionized our understanding of Antarctic penguins. So my own work is in Antarctica, and in particular I study these 4 species here, the Adelie penguin, the Gentoo penguin, the chinstrap, and the emperor penguin. So we have a pretty vigorous crowd here, adventurous crowd. So who among you have been to Antarctica already? Okay, so many of you have, and if you've been to Antarctica, it's almost certainly been on a ship similar to this one, traveling from the tip of South America down to Antarctica. And in fact, at the peak of tourism just prior to COVID-19, about 70,000 people went to vacation to look at the penguins here on the Antarctic Peninsula. So you can see why counting penguins directly, while it gets us some handle on the smallest populations, is actually not going to help on the largest populations. And in fact, the vast majority of our uncertainty about how many penguins even live in Antarctica is due to colonies like this. These are the largest, the most remote, the most poorly known colonies in the world. And if you look very carefully here, you'll see there's actually at least 2 species of penguin breeding cheek to jowl. If they had either cheeks or jowls, they have neither, but these become very difficult to survey in the field. But luckily, penguins are prolific poopers, and the excrement that they create at the site actually creates something of a bit of a miracle, which is that these stains are exactly the shape and size of the penguin colonies themselves. You can see the physics of penguin defecation here. The guano does not get far from the penguin that produced it. And what this means is that we can actually see, if not penguins from space, we can see penguin colonies from space. And that allows us to actually look down on the entire continent and start looking where all the penguin colonies are, and importantly, where they're not. So if you want to see what this actually looks like, this is one of these satellite images right here. This pink peachy guano stain is the penguin colony here right by the ocean. Each of the pixels in this image, for the highest quality images that we have, is about 31 centimeters on a side, which means it's just a bit larger than a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. We use satellite imagery actually or I should say, in using satellite imagery to survey Antarctica for penguin colonies, discovered some exceptionally large but unknown penguin colonies in a place called the Danger Islands. In response, we organized an expedition with a number of other partners. We're actually very lucky to have 2 of the members of that expedition here. So we have Rachel Herman and Alex Borowitz. If you raise your hands, you can tackle them later to ask them questions about what it was like to go to one of the most remote, the largest Adelie penguin colonies in Antarctica. What's amazing is that our subsequent survey of the danger islands allowed us to show that there are more Adelie penguins in this tiny archipelago than the entire rest of the Antarctic Peninsula combined. And as a direct result of our discovery, the proposed marine protected area for the western Antarctic Peninsula was expanded by about 2 million hectares to include the danger islands. So a really exciting demonstration of how, technology and exploration really can lead to better conservation. And that kind of thing does give me hope. So satellite imagery allows us to work across 11 orders of magnitude, not only looking at where all the penguins are at the continental scale, but by connecting satellite imagery with the drone imagery that you saw just a screenshot of earlier, we can zoom in and look at, this is the danger islands here, and then we can connect that to all of the science that we do in the field. So not only just understanding where all the penguins are across the Antarctic continent, but actually understanding at the nest by nest level why penguins are nesting in some areas and not in others. And then of course to connect that to the kind of work that we're doing in the field, genetics, ecotoxicology, hormones, behavior, and diet. So what are the threats that Antarctic penguins are facing today? Well, we talked a little bit about tourism, okay? So for those of you that went to Antarctica, I'm going to acquit you of the crime of harassing penguins, which is to say that we've looked at this issue a lot, and that's not to say that ecotourism can't have impacts, but we have not found a link between tourism, because it's heavily regulated in the Antarctic, and declines of the Antarctic penguins that we study, all right? So that's great news. It was a mixed decision. On the charge of the carbon footprint required to get to Antarctica, very guilty. And so that's something that we should all be thinking about. I think that's the conversation that we're not having. All right, but Antarctic krill fishing is another big threat that Antarctic penguins face. And when we're talking about Antarctic krill fishing, we're not talking about a line and a hook, right? We're talking about vacuuming up big parts of the ocean and filtering out the krill. Why bother? Well, dietary supplements and aquaculture are the two big uses, which means that even if you don't think that you've eaten krill, you almost certainly have eaten krill or something that ate krill. So krill fishing is a big concern, because if we're eating the food that the penguins need, obviously that might not leave enough left over for the penguins themselves. So we want to make sure that we have a very tightly regulated market for krill supplements. If you go to Costco, you'll find that your krill oil is considered marine sustainable. It is marketed as being sustainable. I would take that with a grain of salt. I think there's still a lot of work to be done to understand whether the krill harvest that we have now is in fact sustainable. But climate change is the elephant in the room. So climate change isn't just one thing. That's why we no longer call it global warming, right? Why don't we call it global warming? Because it's not just that things are getting warmer. In the Antarctic, some areas are getting colder. Some areas are getting warmer. In some areas, the ice is disappearing. In other areas, the ice is expanding. The winds are changing. Precipitation is changing. All of these things are impacting the animals that live in Antarctica, penguins, maybe most notably. On the Antarctic Peninsula, which is where you went if you went to Antarctica on vacation, it's a relatively straightforward story. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the most rapidly warming places on the planet, and what we're seeing in response is a clear decline in the truly Antarctic Adelie penguin and a commensurate rise in the sub-Antarctic Gentoo penguin. So what we've seen is a total turnover in an ecosystem which was really Adelie dominated into one that's more sub-Antarctic Gentoo dominated. I would say that, when I started my career trying to understand these trends, this would have been an entire PhD dissertation. We're now at the stage where pulling this data together, as I did for National Geographic, took about 15 minutes. That's how far we've come in our understanding of where the penguins are and how many there are. But on the theme of hope, where the ice is still abundant, these penguins are as well. So this is a New York Times, Science Times story that was written about a recent expedition that we did, and we have one representative of that expedition, Michael Wethington here in the back. So we did a big expedition to the Weddell Sea to try and answer the question, how are the Adelies doing that are in the areas where the climate has been more stable? And sure enough, where the climate has been more stable, the penguins are more stable as well, right? So if we can get a handle on climate change, we really can save the penguins. So I just want to connect this sort of changing face of Antarctic exploration that I've talked about, all this high tech and drones and satellites, to the recent discovery of the Endurance, just to remind us I think of these two things as really bookending what it means to do Antarctic exploration. It no longer means surviving for a month on these biscuits, which you'll see is a good thing. And it really does mean that actually we can take a bird's eye view of the Antarctic, and we no longer can say that we didn't know what there was to conserve. So with that, thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Heather. Heather really went above and beyond, not only pulling together this presentation, but actually baking up sledging biscuits for us to try. And not only did she bake them, but she carried them here and brought them to the club. So we have a few here, but after this session, we will, hopefully many of you will stay on and go down to the Penguin Parlor, which has been beautifully decorated to look a lot like the habitats in Antarctica, and also the Galapagos and Magellanic penguins from Patagonia. And we'll also have a book signing there. Okay, so the sledging biscuits are sitting there. Some of you may be getting hungry, but we're doing well on time. Our third speaker is Professor Dee Boersma. Dee is the Wadsworth Endowed Chair for Conservation Science at the University of Washington, and she also heads up something called the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels, and that center looks at penguins, but also many other species that tell us, by learning and listening from them, the state of the planet and how we can take action. I'm happy to be serving on the board of the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. Okay, so I got in trouble before talking about awards, but I'll just say a few. I just have to say a few. Dee is a winner of the Heinz Award, a Fulbright Fellow, a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation. And when I think of Dee, I think of her passion for field work. Not everyone who studies animals actually does field work or does a lot of field work. Dee has studied species of penguins for decades. And in fact, her work on the Galapagos has extended for about 50 years. So I'm happy to ask Dee to step up and tell us about the penguins that she's worked with. And there we have the visuals up. Got it?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. You want a microphone?
Okay, I want to say two things before I really start. One is I've known Heather not as long as I've known Popey, which is longer than I have known Ellen. So I've known these people for a long period of time. I met Popey when he was like 18. Now, he still looks 18. But I've aged during that time, and he doesn't seem to, which is the fountain of youth in some way or another. And Ellen, I've known for before she moved to New York for the second time. So we go back a long time in terms of penguins. And what I really want to talk to you about today is the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. And you've heard a lot about how incredible penguins are. But they really are amazing in that they tell us so much, not only about the ocean, but by the coastal environment and also the land environment where the penguins have to come to land to lay their eggs and to raise their chicks. Because that's a real problem for these penguins. They're very different environments. And all of these penguins, you've heard there's 18 species. Probably before you die, we'll know that there's 19 or 20 species of penguins because the numbers change because of our increased knowledge of genetics and of distribution and abundance. But Popey and I did this book, and this will be on sale for those that want a copy of this. I always say, if you want to write a bestseller, you got to go and do it with a very local press. So we wrote this book with the University of Washington Press, and it was a bestseller. I'm afraid to ever do another book. But we had like 49 authors. They're all from all around the world, so this covers all the species of penguins. Some not as well as others, because when we did this, we thought there were only really 16. But they've taken some of the species apart. Royal penguins separate now from the macaroni penguins. But anyway, this is, I think, because I'm biased, and Popey will say the same thing, this is a good book. So we'll be here to autograph it afterwards. And the other thing that I wanted to also mention is that these penguins, and you can see here, these are actually Galapagos penguins. They live on the equator. I wish it were tropical there, but it's not. But if you go inland, just even a few meters on the lava, you could fry an egg without any trouble at all. It's over 120 degrees. It's black lava. It's really hot. So that's a bit of a problem. And I've been studying Galapagos penguins now for 52 years. I started my career on Galapagos penguins, and I've never been able to give them up. These are such incredible organisms. And here you can see a pair. That's a male and a female together, and they're just kind of playing with one another and being familiar with each other. But this is what I was greeted by when I went to Argentina for the first time. I mean, I'd worked on Galapagos penguins. They're the rarest species of penguins. They have the most restricted distribution. And I wanted to see Magellanic penguins because there were millions of those, and I knew that there were millions of those. And I went to a place called Punta Tombo, which had the largest colony of Magellanic penguins at that time. Now the penguins have reshuffled themselves, so Punta Tombo is no longer the biggest colony of Magellanic penguins, but it still has like 120,000 birds that breed there every year. But this is what I saw on the beaches. It was amazing to me. These are penguins, but you don't see any black and white. Here you can see a little white, and that's because they're completely covered in petroleum. How did that happen? And it was happening all up and down the coast because these birds migrate over 2,000 kilometers. They're swimming through the water. They can swim through the water. They're amazing athletes at over 100 miles a day. None of us can do that. But these guys can, and if they run into petroleum, they end up getting covered, and then they get cold, and then they want to come ashore. And if they come ashore, there's no food on shore. And here you can see a Magellanic penguin, and you can see its breastbone there, just like a chicken's breastbone. And you can see that there's really no flesh on it. So it's been starving to death for several weeks. And these penguins do often fast for more than a month. So they're not eating anything. They will if they get a chance. If they're in Antarctica, they eat snow or fresh water. If they're at Punta Tombo, they go into the water and drink seawater, and then they are able to expel the salt out of their nasal glands. But this is not a way for a penguin to live. And we didn't want to see penguins looking like that. What we wanted to see is penguins without oil. But this is the problem that Magellanic penguins face. They go all the way from a place that you've now heard more than you wanted to know about, Punta Tombo, right here. And they migrate all the way up to Brazil. And then the following spring, they come back down to their breeding colonies. There's breeding colonies here at Punta Tombo. There's big breeding colonies on the peninsula of Valdez. And they spend the winter off of northern Argentina, Uruguay, or Brazil. And this little fellow shows you the problem with oil pollution. Rapolo, which is this green line here, was oiled not once, but twice. He got oiled 1 year in Uruguay, fortunately was found by people, washed off, rehabilitated, released, and 2 years later, lucky Rapolo ended up off of Mar del Plata, and he came ashore right below the aquarium in Mar del Plata where they wash penguins. And he got washed a second time. And here's Rapolo after running into oil for the second time, and he only weighed 2.7 kilos. That's very skinny for a Magellanic penguin. And so what I was talking to Popey about when he was 18 is we got to stop the oiling. This is ridiculous. You can't rehabilitate all these penguins. It's costly. It takes time. It's upsetting to the penguins. We got to stop the pollution. Because we want all the penguins to look like this. This is a Magellanic penguin adult with the 2 chicks, and that's what we'd like to see them look like. But they don't look like this when they get too much rain or when it's too hot. That ends up killing chicks. And what I saw when I first went down to Punta Tombo was a beach that was full in 1984 of Magellanic penguins during the molt. Here in 2022, just at the end of the molt, the beaches are pretty empty. There's just, we've lost almost half of the penguins from the 80s until now. So that's not sustainable. And most of these temperate species of penguins are having trouble because they can't find enough food, let alone the pollution. But they don't find enough food where they are. So this is Humboldt penguins at Punta San Juan. Incredible place to go. And this is the problem. These are anchovies. We have fisheries that take all these fish out, and then they put them on these conveyor belts, and they turn them into protein and oil. They feed salmon and other forage fish with these, and this is a real problem because there's just not that much food. And the other thing is it's not only Magellanic penguins that are having trouble finding food, Humboldt penguins because of the El Niños and the Galapagos because of the El Niños, but also South African penguins. And you'd like to be able to see these South African penguins courting, like these two are, in South Africa. But as Popey told you, once there were millions, now there's 20,000 breeding pairs, and that's about it. So this is what an island in Namibia looks like in the 1930s. You can see all these penguins around. This is the same island. You can see these peaks here, over here, and there's no penguins. So there's really been incredible changes, and particularly for these temperate species of penguins, because we're taking their food along with the climate change affecting the fisheries in the area. And so fisheries have collapsed in South Africa, and there's just not enough food for the penguins. I've come back to Galapagos penguins, which I've worked on, as I told you, for over 50 years. This is a good-looking male Galapagos penguins. When I was at Punta Tombo, I saw more penguin behavior and more penguins in about 5 minutes there than I'd seen in over a year in the Galapagos. Well, these Galapagos penguins are pretty amazing, but one of the problems that they have is nests. They've got to find nests that are out of the sun. Here you can see a female with her 2 eggs. We've actually built that nest with a crowbar by digging a hole in the lava, and we've made 120 of those nests, and the penguins have moved in and are using them. So it's really exciting to see this rare penguin using these nests. You can see her, she's moving her eggs around. And so what I want to leave you with is the idea that we can all make a difference for penguins. You just have to do long-term studies, help support them so we can know more about these penguins so that we can save them in the long run. And with that, Ellen, I turn it back to you.
Great job. Okay, so again, today's theme is conservation and the Penguin Hour, and I think you've heard a lot about not only how adorable penguins are, but all the threats that are facing them and what people are doing to try to make a difference. And although we've heard some really sad stories about penguins and seen pictures of what there used to be and what there is now, which don't make us happy, we've also heard the importance of science, that science can really influence policy. It provides the documentation, it provides the information that decision makers need to rely upon to make good decisions, to prompt them to want to make a change. So we've heard a lot of good things. There are success stories also that we've heard today. I'm going to have you come up. We do have time for question and answer. You have been a very patient audience, and so I'd like to ask all the speakers to come up. And you can say some things first, and then I'll open it up to Q&A.
Ellen wanted me to do this in 10 minutes. I did it 10 minutes and 36 seconds, so I got close. But the thing that I missed is to tell you the exciting story about Rapolo and the rest of the penguins. It took more than 20 years. We first saw this problem in 1982. It took until 97 to move the tanker lanes 40 kilometers further offshore in Argentina. And I just went back with Esteban Freres. We walked the beaches, 28 kilometers of beach. And as I said to Esteban at the time, we got to do this soon. I don't know if I'll be able to do it in 5 years. And you've gained a little weight. And I don't know whether you'll be able to do it in 5 more years. And we walked those beaches, and we didn't find one oil penguin. None. That was really exciting. So you can make a difference if we just keep working on it and use the science to push policymakers to make the world better for penguins. And then we have to do the right things in terms of cutting down our carbon footprint, what we eat, all of those sorts of things. And of course, I'm a great believer in we need to reduce our consumption, but also our human numbers. There's too many of us.
Okay. So you got the last word in before the Q&A. One other thing, because I know that you're all going to want a copy of this book. Heather Lynch is also a contributor to the book. So all 3 of our speakers today will be available to sign the book for you. And if you buy it today, the publisher is giving a special discount to members who are here, and not just members, but anyone who's here for World Oceans Week. Okay, so now it's your turn. Any questions for our speakers? Yes.
So I'm so interested in the project you did. You built 120 nests for those penguins. Thank you. I'm pretty loud anyway. Thank you. You built 120 nests for those penguins. How did you conceive of doing a project like that? And were you the first to ever do it? And are other projects like that where human beings are getting out there and trying to build habitat for penguins?
This was a crazy idea, really, to build, nests for penguins in the Galapagos. But I couldn't see any other way, and the reason is when I was a graduate student studying Galapagos penguins, I saw this pair that laid their eggs out in the open. And by 9 o'clock every day, they were panting, just like Popey's picture. And by like 9:30 or 10, they were off, and they didn't come back to their nest until 4 o'clock in the afternoon when it got cooler. And so their eggs fried. And I thought about that for about 40 years. And I thought, we could do something about that. And I've then talked to this friend that I've worked with for now 50 years, Godfrey Merlin, who lives in the Galapagos. And I said, I don't want to do this unless you want to do this. Because you can't do anything in a country that's not yours. I'm the first to know that. That's why Popey is so important. Americans are not well liked in most places, let alone Argentina. And they're certainly not well regarded, particularly in Ecuador. And the first thing that the national park said to me is, if you're going to build nests here, they got to look natural. None of these doggy igloos or anything like that. And I said, okay, we'll build them out of lava. And they said, you'll build them out of lava? I said, yeah, we're going to make them like carports, but you'll never know that they're penguin nests. We'll just put up lava slabs and then lava on the top. I know where the lava is. We'll just haul it over. My friend Sue, I invited her to come down and help, and she said, I think I'll come some other time when you're not building nests. So some people are smarter than I am. But we built 120 of these nests, and now some of these nests, particularly penguins are fussy. They like them really dug into the rock like you saw there. They don't like the carports. They're too hot. They really like them in the tunnels. But we've had some of those nests now used 4 times, often by 2 different pairs. So this is really exciting. So I think you can do these sorts of things. We now know that little blue penguins, they actually prefer nesting boxes if you dig them a good nesting box. And that's true for other species of penguins as well. But this is the first time it was tried for Galapagos penguins. We had some Magellanics that we built some nests for. But, you know, there's so many possibilities for nests at Punta Tumble. They don't need nests. There's plenty of bushes that they can nest under. They can dig their own burrows. So not everything has to have this kind of change in habitat. But what you need to do is have enough habitat where they can breed. I mean, why are they breeding on the mainland of Argentina? They didn't used to do that. The first penguins that showed up at Punta Tumble were in 1924. And then we had over 300,000 breeding pairs at Punta Tumble. And now we're down to, 110,000 breeding pairs. Why such fluctuations? Well, it turns out sheep ranching is not really compatible with pumas. Pumas like to eat penguins. Why do penguins nest on islands? Well, there's no predators there. So if you move them on, you've got to bring people in to kill the predators off, and that's what happened at Punta Tumble.
Great, thanks for that. Anyone else? Oh, actually, there's another microphone coming.
Thank you. This is potentially a less scientific question, but...
Can you bring the mic closer?
Yeah, sorry.
That's good.
This is a potentially less scientific question. Penguins are obviously a highly charismatic organism, and for young marine scientists such as myself, one would only aspire to have the kind of interactions or observations of penguins that you would have had. So I was just wondering, what is maybe the most charismatic or most hilarious either encounter with a penguin or kind of moment that you have seen penguins interacting with each other or something like that?
I don't know which is, it is amazing because sometimes when you receive like BBC or National Geographic, the film crews, they used to film very weird animals. There used to be hidden 3 days to get a picture. With penguins, you have a situation in each nest. So in one afternoon, they can have a complete documentary film. So when you are spending a lot of time in the field, you see so many different things. Like, I don't know if this is the funniest, but last year I was filming for National Geographic these capsules, and a group of penguins started to fight in my back, and really, attacking each other and coming into me. And then that was really unexpected, and it got like 25,000 likes in National Geographic. I don't know, it was completely unprepared or something, but that happens with penguins. And the fights are aggressive, but they're also so interesting to understand how they behave.
The stories that stick in my mind are the ones that remind me how rugged penguins are. So the very first time I went to Antarctica, I saw my first penguin. It was a chin-strap penguin, and I'm like, like the clouds parted and the sun, and I'm like, oh, my first penguin. And it dives off a cliff and it lands on a pointy rock, like right on the top of its head, and then like rolls into the ocean. And I'm like, oh my God, like the penguin is dead. Like the first penguin I ever saw has just died before my eyes. And this person, like, a more experienced researcher next to me is like, it'll be fine. And like, sure enough, like it pops up and it was just like in the cartoon, and then it just swam off. And I was like, wow, these guys are just amazing. And just another example of that is once we were in a big colony of king penguins, and this one king penguin had been attacked by a leopard seal at some point in the distant past. It had a hole almost right through its chest, but the feathers had regrown like the inside of a toilet roll, like hole, like all the way into its chest, and you're just like, that is so amazing that it managed to survive an attack like that. So sometimes you're just blown away by their ability to persist in just incredible conditions.
I'll just do one quick one as well. These two penguins had a terrible fight and scared one penguin, and he ran into a bush and he got a stick stuck in his chest. Oh. Right in. I mean, like about that far in. And I looked at that and I thought, oh, wait, that's not good to keep that in there. I had to pull that out. So I pulled it out, and of course it started bleeding. And the next thing I did is I reached in my back pocket where I had some toilet paper, and I shoved it in the hole. And that stopped the bleeding. And 2 weeks later, I saw that penguin with a little piece of toilet paper sticking out, and he was fine. They are just incredibly resilient.
Thank you for that. That was a great question, by the way. Everyone answered. I think we have time for one more question. There's the lucky person in the room.
Thank you so much. This was so instructive, especially for somebody not in marine biology or nature, but just loving nature. I was wondering if you could comment on maybe what's happening in today's, I guess, media, of how sometimes a good story catches the zeitgeist, like last year about the octopus, right, and the Seaspiracy. And I'm wondering, it's almost like there needs to be a show about penguins on Netflix to get the attention, so you get the chance to actually speak to a wider audience. Because it feels like this is a community that's really excited about this, but we need to spread this to more people, I guess. I was wondering if you have any comments.
Who wants to take that one on?
I always like to take these on because I think the March of the Penguins is incredible. It's the major documentary. It's the biggest grossing documentary in all of history. But the thing that's amazing about that is everybody likes March of the Penguins. The conservatives like it. Why? They think that penguins are egalitarian, that they work really hard, they're taking care of their chicks. It turns out that particularly emperor penguins have the highest divorce rate of any of the species of penguins. And the divorce rate for penguins is high. Magellanic penguins, 50% of them get divorced. And they don't stay together usually very long. That's 50% for several years. So it's all in our minds. And I think the incredible thing is if we can use penguins as really good sentinels and good ambassadors, we can get more people to care about the wild life of penguins and can protect more of our planet. We're impoverishing our planet. I mean, I'm old enough. These two are too young. But, you know, I remember used to drive a car, and my dad would complain all the time. Get the bugs off the windshield. Can't you get out there and clean off the windshield? And what about the lights, as long as you're at it? Now you can drive your car for days, and there's no bugs on your windshield. What does that mean? It means there's no bugs for birds. And if there's no bugs for birds, we're not going to have as many birds. And we're seeing all of this impoverishing of our wildlife and of our wild places. And I think we've got to change that around. And that means we need to live in better balance with nature. And we're not doing it well.
Sophie, did you have a comment?
So I think that one of the biggest challenges for conservationists comes to communication now. You can do research, which is completely necessary, but you're not going to change the behavior of people showing your graphs or your science. Science it's extremely necessary, but it won't change. And sometimes researchers, we keep on singing to the choir. And even conservationists, we keep on talking to the same people that are already believe in conservation. So I celebrate every single tool that we can use to reach those new circles, like your initiative, including art, because it's through emotions that we can funnel our science and reach the emotion of people and tell them this is what we should do. But if we don't reach their emotions with new communication tools, we will never make a change.
Heather, you want to last?
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, I think one of the challenges of penguins is that penguins feel very remote for those of us here in the Northern Hemisphere. And when I talk to school groups, I mean, I can talk about, Antarctic penguins, and they can be as passionate as they want to be, and they can't see a connection between them and the penguins. And so what I'm always telling them is, like, we think about there being, 5 oceans or whatever, but we live on the North Shore of Long Island. These kids can protect their ocean. And their ocean is the Southern Ocean, and it's the Atlantic Ocean, it's the Pacific Ocean. If we can keep pollution out of our oceans, our coastlines, plastic off our beaches, that's the best thing these kids can do for the penguins. And I think the key is not just getting them excited, but connecting it to their local environment, because that's really all you can do, right? It's like all conservation is local. It has to be. And so here in New York, we have a responsibility to protect our own harbors, and in the long term, that's going to protect all those species that depend on the ocean.
Okay, so let's have a big round of applause for all of our speakers. And before we leave, I'm going to crown Heather with a chef's hat.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm going to let you put it on. I'll help you get it around that clip.
The blame or the...
Oh, that looks fantastic. Okay, we need a photo here. That's great. So, okay.
The recipes will be there. I will just as a note, one of them is Actually, they're both vegetarian, but one does have walnut oil in it. So if you have allergies, just read the ingredients. But the difference is that I think the Amundsen one kept them alive all the way there and back. The Scott one, not so much. So you can take that for what it is. But the recipes are there next to the recipes, and you can see which one you like better. Yeah, sorry. I will just say that lard being somewhat harder to buy these days than it was 100 years ago was substituted for Crisco. So they are both actually vegetarian. But you're right. The original one would have had fresh lard in it.
Okay, so I encourage you to go down to the Penguin Parlor, and all of our speakers will be down there imbibing the special cocktail that was developed by... Oh, it's going to have some rum in it, too. And you'll be able to taste the different biscuits and decide for yourself which seems better to you. And there'll be the book signing. So thanks, everyone.